The forest is quiet now. Tall trees surround the hill above the German city of Weimar, and the wind moves softly through the branches as if nothing had ever happened there. The roads are empty. The guard towers stand still. The long rows of barracks no longer hold the movement of thousands of prisoners forced to exist within a system built entirely on control, routine, and fear. But in 1937, this hill became something very different. The camp known as Buchenwald was constructed not at the edge of war, but in the center of a growing system. It was designed to expand, designed to organize, designed to intimidate. From the beginning, its structure reflected authority through visibility, discipline, and constant observation. Men arrived by train and truck from across Germany and occupied Europe. Many stepped into the camp without fully understanding where they had been taken. What they encountered was not chaos, but order. A carefully arranged environment where every movement, every routine, and every hour of the day was controlled. Inside Buchenwald, fear was not always expressed through noise or violence. Often it existed in repetition, in silence, in uncertainty, in the awareness that the system surrounding the prisoners operated continuously, without pause. In this documentary, we will move slowly through the camp structure, daily life, labor system, internal organization, and atmosphere of control, examining how Buchenwald functioned and how its environment shaped the experience of those forced to live inside it. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters, and together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Hill Above Weimar. As one considers the origins of Buchenwald, the environment in which the camp was constructed becomes central to understanding its atmosphere and structure, and it becomes evident that the camp's location was not accidental but carefully selected, positioned on the Ettersberg hill above. The German city of Weimar, where forested surroundings and elevated ground created a setting that was both physically isolated and symbolically imposing, and as this develops, the relationship between landscape and authority begins to emerge, where the camp existed not hidden in a distant wilderness but near a city deeply associated with German cultural history, creating a striking contrast between the ideals of culture and the realities of confinement. And as one reflects on this setting, it becomes clear that the forest itself played an important role in shaping the perception of the camp, where tall trees surrounded the area and narrow roads wound through wooded terrain, before opening suddenly into the structured space of the campgrounds. And this transition from natural environment to controlled enclosure created a distinct psychological effect, where movement through open forest gave way to fences, guard towers, and barracks arranged according to strict order. And as this develops further, the concept of elevation becomes increasingly significant, where the hilltop position of Buchenwald reinforced its visibility and separation from the surrounding region, and this elevation influenced not only the physical environment but also the atmosphere experienced by those arriving there, where the climb toward the camp marked a gradual movement away from ordinary surroundings and into a controlled system. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the natural environment remained constantly present, where changing weather, moving fog, wind through the trees, and seasonal changes shaped the atmosphere around the camp, creating an environment in which the natural world existed alongside rigid human organization. And this contrast between forest and structure contributed to the overall experience of Buchenwald, where the stillness of nature surrounded a place defined by routine, observation, and control. And as this develops, the layout of the camp itself begins to take form within the landscape, where cleared areas cut into the forest allowed for the construction of barracks, administrative buildings, internal roads, and assembly grounds, and these spaces were arranged according to a system designed for visibility and order, ensuring that movement within the camp could be directed and observed efficiently. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the location of Buchenwald shaped how the camp functioned, where isolation provided separation while proximity to infrastructure allowed transportation and administration to operate effectively, and this balance between remoteness and accessibility became part of the camp's operational identity. And as this develops further, the process of construction itself becomes important, where the early development of the camp transformed the wooded hill into a structured environment through labor, planning, and expansion, creating a space that would continue to grow in both size and complexity over time. And as we consider the perspective of those arriving during the camp's early period, it becomes clear that the environment they encountered was one defined by contrast, where natural surroundings existed alongside visible systems of control, and this contrast reinforced the sense that Buchenwald was not simply a temporary holding area but a carefully organized institution designed for permanence and expansion. And as this develops, the relationship between environment and perception becomes increasingly apparent, where the physical setting shaped awareness from the very first moments of arrival, influencing how individuals understood the boundaries, structure, and atmosphere of the camp, and thus the hill above Weimar can be understood not merely as the location of Buchenwald, but as an active component of its identity, shaping the environment, the structure, and the experience of those brought there from the very beginning. As the camp expanded upon the hill above Weimar, the surrounding environment continued to influence the structure and atmosphere of daily life within Buchenwald, and it becomes evident that the relationship between the camp and the forested landscape remained constant, where the natural surroundings formed a visible boundary beyond the fences while also reinforcing the sense of separation that defined the environment. And as this develops, the concept of isolation becomes increasingly significant, where the wooded terrain and elevated position created physical distance from ordinary urban life, contributing to the perception that the camp existed within its own enclosed system, governed by its own routines, schedules, and rules. And as one reflects on this arrangement, it becomes clear that the transition from open landscape to enclosed camp space shaped the experience of movement and arrival, where roads leading upward through the forest gradually narrowed perception until the structures of the camp came into view, and this progression reinforced the atmosphere of control, where entry into the camp marked a visible and immediate separation from the surrounding world. And as this develops further, the environmental conditions of the hill itself played an important role in daily experience, where weather patterns, shifting temperatures, and seasonal changes influenced how the camp was perceived and navigated. And during colder months, fog and snow altered visibility across the grounds, while in warmer seasons, dust, sunlight, and long daylight hours shaped the atmosphere of routine activities. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this environment, it becomes evident that the sounds of nature remained present even within the controlled structure of the camp, where wind through trees, rain on baroque roofs, and distant echoes across open spaces created a layered atmosphere that contrasted with the rigid organization imposed by the administration. And this coexistence of natural sound and structured routine contributed to the unique environment of Buchenwald, where the camp was never fully separated from the landscape in which it existed. And as this develops, The process of expanding the camp further altered the relationship between nature and structure, where additional buildings, roads, and work areas gradually transformed sections of the hill into organized spaces designed for efficiency and control, and this expansion reflected the broader growth of the camp system itself, where increasing numbers of prisoners and administrative functions required continuous development of infrastructure, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the physical setting of Buchenwald influenced not only appearance but operation, where the terrain shaped movement, visibility, and construction in ways that reinforced the overall system of order, and as this develops further, the concept of visibility becomes increasingly important, where the elevated position of the camp allowed for clear observation across internal spaces, while the surrounding forest created a sense of enclosure beyond the fences, and this balance between openness inside the camp and isolation beyond it reinforced the structured atmosphere that defined daily life. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to this environment, it becomes clear that awareness of the surrounding landscape became part of their experience, where changing weather, shifting light, and the constant presence of the forest shaped perception alongside the routines imposed by the camp, and this awareness contributed to a layered understanding of the environment, where the natural and constructed worlds existed simultaneously within the same space, and as this develops, the connection between environment, routine, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where the physical setting supported the camp structure while also shaping the sensory experience of those within it, and thus the hill above Weimar remained more than a location throughout the operation of Buchenwald, serving as a defining environmental framework that influenced the camp's atmosphere, structure, and daily existence from its earliest days. Onward. Chapter 1, Segment 2. Construction, Expansion, and the Creation of the Camp. As one considers the early formation of Buchenwald following the selection of the Ettersberg Hill above Weimar, the process of construction emerges as a defining stage in the creation of the camp, and it becomes evident that Buchenwald did not appear suddenly as a completed institution but developed gradually through organized labor, planning, and continuous expansion, where forested land was transformed into a structured environment designed to support confinement, administration, and control, and as this develops, the relationship between construction and authority becomes increasingly clear, where the physical act of building the camp reflected the broader objectives of organization and permanence, creating an environment intended not as a temporary site but as a growing component within the concentration camp system. And as one reflects on the earliest stages of development, it becomes clear that the landscape itself had to be altered before the camp could function, where trees were cleared, roads were established, and sections of the hill were reshaped to accommodate barracks, fences, and administrative structures, and this transformation of the natural environment into an organized compound marked the beginning of a new physical reality on the hill, where order replaced irregular terrain through measured construction and planning, and as this develops further, the role of labor in building the camp becomes central, where prisoners themselves were forced to participate in the expansion of the environment that confined them, carrying materials, preparing foundations, and constructing roads and structures according to the demands of the administration, and this connection between labor and environment created a system in which the physical growth of the camp was directly tied to the routines imposed upon those inside it. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the sounds of construction became part of the atmosphere of early Buchenwald, where hammering, movement of materials, cutting of timber, and organized work activity combined with the natural sounds of the forest, creating an environment defined by both development and control, and this atmosphere reinforced the sense that the camp was constantly evolving, where each completed structure contributed to a larger and more organized system, and as this develops, the layout of the camp itself begins to take shape through construction, where barracks were arranged in rows, roads connected key areas, and fenced boundaries established the physical limits of movement, and these design choices reflected the principles of visibility and efficiency that shaped the broader camp system, ensuring that activities within the camp could be monitored and directed with consistency, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that construction was not simply a technical process but part of the ideological and administrative framework that defined Buchenwald, where the creation of structured space reinforced authority and transformed the hill into an environment of controlled existence, and as this develops further, the concept of expansion becomes increasingly significant, where the camp continued to grow as additional prisoners arrived and new functions were introduced, requiring more barracks, larger work areas, and expanded administrative facilities, and this ongoing expansion reinforced the sense that Buchenwald was designed for continuous operation rather than temporary use, and as we consider the perspective of those arriving during this early phase, it becomes clear that the unfinished and developing nature of the camp shaped perception, where construction activity remained visible throughout daily life, reminding prisoners that the environment around them was still changing and extending outward, and this visibility contributed to the atmosphere of instability within structure, where order existed alongside constant development, and as this develops, the relationship between construction, routine, and adaptation becomes increasingly interconnected, where individuals learned to navigate a space that was both organized and continuously expanding, and thus the construction of Buchenwald can be understood as a foundational stage in the camp's development, shaping its physical layout, operational structure, and overall atmosphere from the very beginning. As the construction of Buchenwald continued and the camp expanded across the hill above Weimar, the process of development became increasingly organized, and it becomes evident that expansion was guided by a structured vision in which every new building, road, and fenced section contributed to a broader system of administration and control, and as this develops, the concept of planned growth becomes central, where the camp evolved not through random additions but through deliberate arrangements designed to increase capacity, improve organization, and reinforce the operational structure already taking shape, and as one reflects on this process, it becomes clear that the expansion of Buchenwald altered both the physical environment and the daily experience of those inside it, where new barracks changed patterns of movement, additional work areas extended the boundaries of activity, and larger administrative sections reinforced the visible presence of authority throughout the camp, and as this develops further, the relationship between space and organization becomes increasingly apparent, where each section of the camp was assigned specific functions, creating a structured environment in which living areas, work zones, storage facilities, and administrative buildings were connected through internal roads and pathways, and this organization supported the routines that governed daily life, ensuring that movement and activity could be directed with consistency, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this expanding environment, it becomes evident that construction activity remained a continuous presence, where the sounds of labor, movement of materials, and growth of infrastructure became integrated into the atmosphere of the camp itself, reinforcing the sense that Buchenwald was constantly being reshaped and enlarged, and this atmosphere contributed to an awareness that the environment was not static, but continuously developing according to the demands of the system, and as this develops, the role of visibility within the expanding camp becomes significant, where open spaces between barracks, straight internal roads, and elevated guard positions ensured that movement remained observable even as the camp increased in size, and this emphasis on visibility reinforced the principles of order and supervision that defined the structure of Buchenwald, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that expansion served not only practical purposes but symbolic ones as well, where the increasing scale of the camp reflected the growing reach and permanence of the concentration camp system itself, and this permanence became visible in the physical transformation of the hill, where forested land gradually gave way to organized structures and controlled space, and as this develops further, the interaction between natural environment and constructed space continued to shape the atmosphere of the camp, where surrounding forests remained visible beyond fences while the interior environment became increasingly defined by roads, buildings, and routines, creating a contrast between the openness of nature and the restrictions of confinement, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to this expanding environment, it becomes clear that awareness of ongoing construction influenced perception, where each new structure represented another extension of the system surrounding them, and this awareness reinforced the understanding that Buchenwald was intended to continue operating and growing over time, and as this develops, the relationship between construction, authority, and routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where the physical growth of the camp supported the administrative systems that governed daily life, while daily routine themselves contributed to the ongoing development of the environment, and thus the expansion of Buchenwald can be understood as a continuous process through which the camp transformed from a newly established site into a large and organized institution, shaping the physical environment, operational structure, and collective experience of those forced to live within it. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Arrival and the First Impressions of Buchenwald. As one considers the experience of arriving at Buchenwald during its early years, the first impressions of the camp emerge as a defining moment in shaping awareness and perception, and it becomes evident that arrival was not experienced as a sudden isolated event, but as a gradual transition from the outside world into a controlled environment structured by movement, observation, and authority, and as this develops, the journey toward the camp itself becomes significant, where prisoners were transported along roads leading upward through the wooded slopes of the Ettersberg hill, moving away from ordinary urban surroundings and into an increasingly isolated landscape, and this movement through forested terrain created a sense of separation long before the camp itself came fully into view, where the narrowing roads, the dense trees, and the gradual climb reinforced the awareness that the destination existed apart from normal daily life, and as one reflects on this progression, it becomes clear that the first visible signs of the camp carried considerable symbolic weight, where fences, guard towers, and organized rows of structures emerged abruptly from the natural surroundings, creating a sharp contrast between forest and controlled space, and this contrast shaped perception immediately, where the visual order of the camp signaled that entry into the environment would involve submission to structure and routine, and as this develops further, the process of entering the camp becomes central, where movement through gates and checkpoints transformed the arrival into a formal transition from open movement into confinement, and this transition was reinforced by the visible presence of guards, administrative personnel, and organized procedures designed to direct groups efficiently into the camp's internal system, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of arrival was defined by a combination of sounds, movements, and visual impressions, where footsteps on gravel shouted instructions, opening gates, and the sight of organized barracks all contributed to an environment structured around control and order, and these sensory details created a powerful first awareness of the camp as a functioning institution rather than a temporary holding area, and as this develops, the role of observation becomes increasingly significant, where newly arrived prisoners attempted to interpret their surroundings through limited visual and auditory cues, noting the arrangement of buildings, the movement of groups already inside the camp, and the patterns of authority visible throughout the environment, and this reliance on observation shaped the earliest understanding of Buchenwald, where knowledge of the camp developed not through explanation but through exposure to its structure and routines, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the process of arrival was designed not only to move prisoners physically into the camp but to introduce them immediately to its atmosphere of discipline and organization, where every visible element reinforced the presence of authority, and as this develops further, the relationship between environment and perception becomes increasingly clear, where the physical layout of the camp, the visibility of guards and fences, and the structured movement of prisoners combined to create an atmosphere in which the boundaries of the system became immediately apparent, and as we consider the perspective of individuals arriving for the first time, it becomes clear that the experience involved both uncertainty and rapid adjustment, where the unfamiliar environment required immediate observation and adaptation in order to navigate the first moments within the camp, and this adaptation began at arrival itself, where individuals learned quickly that movement, time, and behavior were all directed by external authority, and as this develops, the connection between arrival, structure, and awareness becomes increasingly interconnected, where the first impressions of Buchenwald established patterns of perception that would continue to shape daily experience within the camp, and thus the process of arrival can be understood as a foundational stage in the experience of confinement, shaping how prisoners first encountered and understood the environment of Buchenwald from the moment they entered its gates. As the process of arrival continued beyond the first moments at the gates of Buchenwald, the transition from transportation into organized intake became increasingly structured, and it becomes evident that the first impressions formed during entry were reinforced through a sequence of procedures designed to establish order immediately, where movement, waiting, and observation combined to integrate newly arrived prisoners into the camp system, and as this develops, the concept of controlled transition becomes central, where individuals moved from the uncertainty of transport into an environment governed by visible routines and administrative organization, and this transition occurred not gradually but through a carefully directed process in which each stage reinforced awareness of authority and structure, and as one reflects on the environment encountered during these early moments, it becomes clear that the arrangement of space played a major role in shaping perception, where open assembly grounds, rows of barracks, and internal roads created an atmosphere defined by visibility and organization, and this layout ensured that movement remained observable at all times, reinforcing the sense that the camp operated through constant supervision, and as this develops further, the role of waiting becomes significant, where newly arrived prisoners often spent periods standing in organized groups while Instructions were issued and procedures prepared, and this waiting introduced an early experience of structured time within the camp, where personal movement and decision-making were replaced by externally imposed sequences of activity. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the environment of intake was characterized by repetition and coordination, where the movement of groups, the sounds of commands, and the visible routines of guards and functionaries created an atmosphere of continuous organization, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that Buchenwald functioned according to systems already fully established, and as this develops, the process of registration and categorization begins to emerge. Within the arrival experience, where prisoners were gradually introduced into the administrative framework of the camp through procedures that recorded identity, assigned classifications, and organized living arrangements, and these procedures transformed arrival from a temporary moment into the beginning of sustained integration into the camp structure. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the first impressions of Buchenwald extended beyond physical surroundings to include the realization that daily life inside the camp would be governed by routine, discipline, and visibility, and this realization developed quickly through direct exposure to the environment itself, and as this develops further, the relationship between environment and adaptation becomes increasingly important, where individuals learn to interpret the camp through observation, recognizing patterns in movement, hierarchy, and routine that shaped understanding of how the system operated, and this adaptation began immediately during arrival, where awareness of structure became essential for navigating the unfamiliar environment. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners entering the camp for the first time, it becomes clear that the experience involved the rapid replacement of ordinary social and physical conditions with an entirely new framework governed by schedules, classifications, and controlled movement, and this framework became visible in every aspect of the environment, from the arrangement of barracks to the organized procedures of intake. And as this develops, the connection between first impressions and long-term experience becomes increasingly clear, where the structured atmosphere encountered during arrival established the patterns of routine, authority, and awareness that would continue throughout daily life inside Buchenwald, and thus the process of arrival and the first impressions formed within the camp can be understood as a critical stage in shaping the experience of confinement, introducing prisoners immediately to the organized and controlled environment that defined Buchenwald from its earliest years onward. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Registration, Classification, and the Loss of Personal Identity. As one considers the experience that followed arrival at Buchenwald, the process of registration emerges as one of the most significant stages in the transition from the outside world into the structured environment of the camp, and it becomes evident that this process was designed not merely to record information but to reorganize individuals within an administrative system where identity became defined by classification, documentation, and routine rather than personal history. And as this develops, the concept of administrative control becomes central, where every newly arrived prisoner passed through procedures intended to establish order and integrate them into the camp's operational structure, and these procedures reflected the broader emphasis on organization that shaped every aspect of Buchenwald, from its physical layout to its daily routines, and as one reflects on the first stages of registration, it becomes clear that movement through the process itself was carefully directed, where groups were assembled, divided, and guided through designated areas according to a sequence established by the administration, and this sequence reinforced the atmosphere of structure and supervision already encountered during arrival, and as this develops further, the role of documentation becomes increasingly significant, where names, personal details, classifications, and assigned numbers were recorded within the camp's administrative system, creating an official framework through which prisoners would be identified and managed, and this framework transformed individuals into recorded entries within a larger institutional structure, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the environment of registration was defined by repetition and procedure, where lines of prisoners, repeated instructions, movement between desks or designated stations, and the visible presence of administrative personnel created an atmosphere of continuous organization, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that Buchenwald functioned through systems designed for efficiency and control, and as this develops, the assignment of prisoner numbers becomes particularly important, where identification shifted from personal names toward numerical designation within the camp system, and this transition reflected a broader process through which individual identity became increasingly subordinated to administrative classification, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that registration served not only practical administrative purposes but also symbolic ones, where the process itself communicated that entry into the camp involved integration into a structured institution governed by rules, categories, and documentation, and this realization shaped awareness from the earliest days of confinement, and as this develops further, the concept of classification becomes increasingly central, where prisoners were assigned categories based on political, social, national, or other criteria established by the administration, and these classifications influenced living arrangements, labor assignments, and treatment within the camp, creating a hierarchy embedded directly into the administrative system, and as we consider the perspective of individuals moving through these procedures, it becomes clear that the process required rapid adaptation to unfamiliar rules and expectations, where understanding the structure of registration became necessary for navigating the environment itself, and this adaptation occurred through observation of routine, repetition of procedure, and awareness of authority within the intake system, and as this develops, the relationship between administration and environment becomes increasingly interconnected, where the physical spaces used for registration reinforced the organized nature of the camp. Through orderly movement, visible supervision, and structured procedures, and thus the process of registration at Buchenwald can be understood as a foundational stage in the experience of confinement, where administrative organization transformed arrival into integration within a system defined by classification, control, and the restructuring of identity. As the process of registration continued within Buchenwald, the system of classification and identification became more deeply integrated into daily life, and it becomes evident that the administrative procedures introduced during intake extended far beyond the initial moments of arrival, shaping how prisoners were organized, observed, and understood within the structure of the camp, and as this develops, the concept of identity within the camp environment becomes increasingly tied to assigned categories and recorded information rather than personal individuality, where administrative labels determine placement within the broader operational system, and this transformation reflected the camp's emphasis on order and control through documentation, and as one reflects on this process, it becomes clear that classification created visible divisions within the prisoner population, where categories influenced Baroque assignments, labor roles, and patterns of interaction, reinforcing the hierarchical structure embedded within the administration itself, And as this develops further, the visual symbols associated with classification become significant, where badges, markings, and numerical identifiers served not only practical purposes but also reinforced the constant visibility of administrative status within the camp environment, and these symbols created an atmosphere in which categorization remained continuously present in daily life, shaping awareness and perception among both prisoners and authorities. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the environment of administration was characterized by repetition and routine, where records, inspections, movement between designated areas, and the continuous verification of identity reinforced the structured nature of the system, and this repetition contributed to the understanding that the camp operated through ongoing documentation rather than temporary intake procedures alone. And as this develops, the relationship between classification and routine becomes increasingly apparent, where daily activities such as work assignments, roll calls, and baroque organization were all influenced by the categories established during registration, creating a system in which administrative decisions shaped nearly every aspect of daily existence. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the process of classification contributed to the gradual erosion of personal identity within the camp environment, where individuality became secondary to administrative designation, and this transformation was reinforced continuously through routine, visibility, and repetition. And as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes central, where prisoners learn to navigate the camp through awareness of classifications, hierarchies, and administrative expectations, adjusting their behavior according to the structure imposed upon them. And this adaptation was shaped by observation, where individuals interpreted the environment through the visible systems of organization surrounding them. And as we consider the perspective of those living within this framework, it becomes clear that awareness of classification became an unavoidable aspect of daily life, influencing movement, interaction, and understanding of the camp itself. And this awareness contributed to a collective perception of Buchenwald as an institution governed by systems of documentation and categorization as much as by physical confinement. And as this develops, the relationship between administration, authority, and perception becomes increasingly interconnected, where the structured procedures of registration extended outward into every aspect of the environment, shaping how prisoners experience time, space, and social organization within the camp. And thus, the processes of registration and classification at Buchenwald can be understood as central mechanisms through which the camp established order, reinforced authority, and transformed individuals into components within a larger administrative system defined by routine, visibility, and control. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Barracks, Living Space, and the Organization of Daily Existence. As one considers the transition from registration into the routines of daily life within Buchenwald, the barracks emerge as one of the most significant environments shaping the prisoner experience. And it becomes evident that these structures were not merely places of shelter, but carefully organized spaces designed to support the broader systems of order, visibility, and control that define the camp. And as this develops, the concept of collective living becomes central, where large groups of prisoners were housed together within enclosed spaces arranged according to administrative planning rather than personal choice. And this arrangement created an environment in which proximity, routine, and observation became constant aspects of existence. And as one reflects on the physical structure of the barracks, it becomes clear that they were designed for efficiency and organization, where rows of bunks, narrow walkways, and limited personal space reinforced the structured atmosphere of the camp, and this organization shaped movement and interaction inside the buildings, ensuring that daily activities unfolded within visible and controlled patterns, and as this develops further, the relationship between space and routine becomes increasingly significant, where waking, resting, preparation for work, and evening return all occurred within the same confined environment, creating a repetitive cycle in which the barracks served as both living quarters and centers of daily organization, and this repetition contributed to the continuity that defined life within Buchenwald, where each day began and ended within the same structured surroundings, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the barracks possessed a distinct atmosphere shaped by sound, movement, and shared occupancy, where footsteps across wooden floors, shifting bodies within crowded spaces, quiet conversation, and the constant presence of others created an environment of uninterrupted collective awareness, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that privacy and separation from the group were largely absent within camp life, and as this develops, the role of arrangement within the barracks becomes increasingly important, where sleeping spaces, storage areas, and internal organization reflected the broader administrative emphasis on structure and classification, ensuring that even within living quarters, order remained visible and regulated, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the barracks functioned not simply as physical shelters but as extensions of the camp's organizational system, where daily life was structured through schedules, inspections, and assigned spaces that reinforced discipline and routine, and as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes observation and adjustment, aligning themselves with the rhythms and expectations established within the Baroque environment, and this adaptation was shaped by repetition where familiarity with routines and spatial organization allowed individuals to move through daily life with increasing awareness of how the environment functioned, and as we consider the relationship between barracks and broader camp structure, it becomes clear that these buildings served as foundational units within the larger system, connecting personal existence to administrative control through architecture, routine, and proximity, and as this develops, the connection between environment and perception becomes increasingly apparent, where the physical arrangement of the barracks shaped how prisoners experienced time, movement, and interaction within the camp, reinforcing the atmosphere of organization and confinement that defined Buchenwald, and thus, the barracks can be understood as central spaces within the camp's operation, shaping both the physical conditions and the collective experience of daily existence from the earliest stages of imprisonment onward. As the routines of daily life within the barracks became more established, the structures themselves began to shape not only physical existence but also patterns of awareness and collective adaptation, and it becomes evident that the organization of living space influenced nearly every aspect of prisoner experience, where the constant presence of others, the repetition of routine, and the visible structure of the environment created a continuous atmosphere of shared existence, and as this develops, the concept of communal rhythm becomes increasingly significant, where individuals living within the same barracks adjusted themselves to common schedules, movements, and expectations, creating a pattern of collective behavior shaped by the structure of the space itself, and as one reflects on this process, it becomes clear that the barracks functioned according to predictable cycles, where morning preparation, evening return, inspections, and periods of rest followed consistent sequences that reinforced the broader routine of the camp, and this predictability contributed to a sense of continuity within daily life, even within the restrictions imposed by the environment, and as this develops further, the role of internal organization becomes more apparent, where designated sleeping areas, assigned positions, and the arrangement of personal belongings reflected the administrative emphasis on order, and this organization reinforced the visibility of structure even within moments intended for rest or limited privacy. And as we consider the sensory aspects of the barracks environment, it becomes evident that the constant proximity of individuals created an atmosphere defined by shared sound and movement, where coughing, footsteps, shifting bunks, whispered exchanges, and the creaking of wooden structures formed a continuous background to daily life, and this atmosphere contributed to the understanding that existence within the camp was deeply collective, shaped by the unavoidable presence of others within confined space. And as this develops, the relationship between barracks and authority becomes increasingly significant, where inspections, roll calls, and supervision extended directly into living quarters, reinforcing the idea that the camp's systems of observation and control remained active even during periods away from labor or assembly grounds. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the barracks represented more than temporary accommodation, functioning instead as environments where the principles of order, discipline, and collective organization were reproduced continuously, and this reproduction shaped both behavior and perception within the camp. And as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly complex, where prisoners learned not only to navigate physical limitations but also to interpret the social dynamics of shared living space, adjusting to patterns of cooperation, observation, and coexistence within the Baroque structure. And this adaptation was shaped by routine and repetition, where familiarity with daily cycles allowed individuals to anticipate movement and activity within the environment. And as we consider the perspective of those living inside these spaces over extended periods, it becomes clear that the barracks became central reference points within camp life, where memories of daily routine, interaction, and awareness were anchored to the physical structure of the buildings themselves, and this connection reinforced the broader atmosphere of Buchenwald as a place where architecture and administration work together to shape existence. And as this develops, the relationship between collective living, routine, and perception becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the structured environment of the camp, and thus the barracks at Buchenwald can be understood as essential components of the camp's operational system, shaping the physical, social, and psychological dimensions of daily life within an environment built upon organization, visibility, and control. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Routine, roll calls, and the structure of daily order. As one considers the daily operation of Buchenwald following the processes of registration and integration into Baroque life, the establishment of routine emerges as one of the most important mechanisms through which the camp maintained order and continuity, and it becomes evident that routine was not simply a practical necessity for organizing large numbers of prisoners, but a defining structure that shaped awareness, movement, and perception throughout each day. And as this develops, the concept of scheduled existence becomes central, where daily life unfolded according to repeated sequences directed entirely by external authority, and these sequences governed nearly every activity within the camp, from waking in the morning to returning to the barracks at night, creating an environment in which time itself became structured through repetition and supervision. And as one reflects on the beginning of each day, it becomes clear that The morning routine established the rhythm that would shape all activities that followed, where prisoners rose according to strict schedules and prepared for assembly under conditions defined by speed, coordination, and observation, and this early transition from sleep into organized movement reinforced the understanding that personal routines had been replaced by collective structure, and as this develops further, the role of roll calls becomes increasingly significant, where large groups assembled in designated areas to be counted, inspected, and organized before labor assignments began, and these assemblies represented far more than administrative procedures, functioning instead as visible demonstrations of order and authority within the camp environment. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that roll calls created a distinct atmosphere shaped by repetition and collective presence, where rows of prisoners standing in formation, the sounds of commands echoing across open grounds, footsteps moving in coordination, and the visible alignment of groups contributed to an environment defined by structure and visibility, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that the camp operated through systems of constant observation and regulated movement, and as this develops, the relationship between routine and discipline becomes increasingly apparent, where the repetition of daily schedules reinforced expectations regarding behavior, timing, and organization, creating patterns that prisoners learned to navigate through observation and adaptation, and these patterns shaped awareness by establishing predictable sequences within the otherwise restrictive environment. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the structure of routine served both practical and symbolic purposes, where orderly movement and scheduled activity supported the camp's operation while also reinforcing the authority of the administration through continuous repetition. And as this develops further, the concept of continuity becomes central, where the repeated execution of the same routines each day created a sense of ongoing progression in which individual days blended together through shared structure, and this continuity shaped how prisoners experienced time within the camp, where the passage of days became measured less by personal events and more by recurring sequences of assembly, labor, and return. And as we consider the perspective of individuals adapting to this environment, it becomes clear that awareness of routine became essential for navigating daily life, where understanding the timing and order of activities allowed prisoners to align themselves with the expectations of the system, and this adaptation was shaped by repetition, where familiarity with schedules and movement patterns reduced uncertainty within the controlled environment. And as this develops, the connection between routine, authority, and perception becomes increasingly interconnected, where each reinforced the others in maintaining the structured operation of Buchenwald, and thus the establishment of routine and roll calls can be understood as foundational elements of camp life, shaping the organization, atmosphere, and experience of daily existence within an environment governed by order and control. As the routines of Buchenwald became more deeply established within daily life, their influence experience that defined the camp environment, and it becomes evident that repetition itself became one of the most powerful forces shaping perception, where the consistent return of the same schedules, movements, and procedures created a structured rhythm that governed how prisoners understood the passage of time and their place within the system. And as this develops, the role of roll calls becomes increasingly central to the atmosphere of the camp, where these repeated assemblies marked the beginning and conclusion of major phases of daily activity, reinforcing the visibility of authority and the collective nature of existence within Buchenwald. And as one reflects on these gatherings, it becomes clear that the physical arrangement of Prisoners during roll calls contributed significantly to the perception of order, where rows of individuals standing in organized formation transformed open spaces into carefully controlled environments defined by symmetry, supervision, and discipline, and this visual organization reinforced the administrative structure of the camp itself, where movement and positioning were directed according to external command rather than personal initiative, and as this develops further, the relationship between routine and environment becomes increasingly apparent, where the same assembly grounds, internal roads, and pathways were used repeatedly each day, creating familiar spatial patterns that shaped movement throughout the camp, and this repetition reinforced the connection between physical space and daily structure, ensuring that the environment itself became part of the routine, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the sounds associated with daily organization formed a continuous backdrop to camp life, where whistles, shouted instructions, synchronized footsteps, and the movement of groups between areas created a rhythm that echoed across the grounds and reinforced the atmosphere of coordination and control, and this auditory environment contributed to the understanding that Buchenwald functioned through uninterrupted systems of organization and observation, and as this develops, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners learned to interpret and respond to the routines surrounding them, using familiarity with schedules and procedures to navigate the environment more effectively, and this adaptation was shaped through observation and repetition, where the predictability of daily structure allowed individuals to anticipate transitions between activities and align themselves with the expectations of the system. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that routine within Buchenwald served not only to organize labor and movement but to create a continuous framework through which the camp's authority remained visible at all times, and this visibility reinforced the perception that daily life operated according to systems extending into every aspect of existence, and as this develops further, the connection between collective experience and routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where shared schedules and repeated assemblies created a common structure shaping how prisoners experience time, movement, and interaction within the camp, and this shared structure contributed to a collective awareness of the environment where individuals understood daily life through the same repeated sequences of activity, and as we consider the perspective of those living within this system over extended periods, it becomes clear that routine gradually transformed from an imposed schedule into the defining framework of existence itself, shaping not only physical movement but also perception and memory within the camp environment, and as this develops, the relationship between repetition, discipline, and continuity becomes increasingly clear, where each element supported the others in maintaining the organized operation of Buchenwald, and thus the routines and roll calls of the camp can be understood as central mechanisms through which order, authority, and collective experience were continuously reinforced within the structured environment of Buchenwald. Chapter 3, Segment 1. Forced Labor and the Expansion of the Camp System. As one considers the daily operation of Buchenwald beyond the establishment of routine and collective organization, the system of forced labor emerges as one of the most central elements, shaping the structure and purpose of the camp, and it becomes evident that labor was not treated as a separate activity within camp life, but as an organizing principle that influenced movement, schedules, administration, and the broader expansion of the camp itself, and as this develops, the relationship between labor and control becomes increasingly clear, where work assignments were integrated directly into the daily routines established through roll calls, inspections, and structured movement, creating an environment in which physical activity and administrative organization function together within a single system. And as one reflects on the early years of Buchenwald, it becomes clear that the camp was designed not only to confine prisoners but also to utilize labor for construction, maintenance, industrial support, and the continuous expansion of infrastructure, and this objective shaped both the physical environment and the experience of those forced to live within it. And as this develops further, the process of assigning labor becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners were divided into organized work details according to classifications, administrative decisions, and practical demands, creating structured groups that moved through the camp according to schedules established by the authorities, and these work details reinforced the atmosphere of organization and discipline already present in other aspects of camp life. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that labor introduced a distinct rhythm into the environment of Buchenwald, where the sounds of construction, movement of tools and materials, marching groups, and industrial activity blended with the broader atmosphere of routine and supervision, creating a camp environment defined by constant motion and organized activity. And this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that the camp operated continuously through systems of labor and control, and as this develops, the relationship between labor and space becomes increasingly apparent, where work assignments extended across different sections of the camp and beyond its immediate boundaries, connecting barracks, workshops, roads, storage areas, and construction sites into a larger operational network. And this network shaped how prisoners experienced movement within the environment, where transitions between living quarters and work areas became repeated patterns defining the structure of each day. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that forced labor played a major role in the physical growth of Buchenwald itself, where prisoners were required to participate directly in the construction and maintenance of the environment surrounding them, creating a system in which the camp expanded through the labor of those confined within it. And as this develops further, the concept of repetition becomes central, where the daily return to assigned tasks created a rhythm that reinforced the broader routines of camp life, shaping awareness through continuous cycles of assembly, movement, labor, and return. And this repetition contributed to the collective experience of time within the camp, where days became structured around work schedules imposed externally by the administration. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to this system, it becomes clear that awareness of labor assignments, schedules, and movement patterns became essential for navigating daily life, where observation and familiarity with routine allowed individuals to anticipate transitions and adjust themselves to the demands of the environment. And this adaptation developed gradually through repetition and exposure to the structured systems surrounding them. And as this develops, the connection between labor, authority, and expansion becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation of Buchenwald, and thus the forced labor system can be understood as a foundational component of the camp structure, influencing its physical growth, administrative organization, and the daily existence of those imprisoned within it. As the system of forced labor became more deeply integrated into the operation of Buchenwald, its influence extended beyond physical work itself and into the broader structure of camp life, shaping routines, perceptions, and the organization of daily existence. And it becomes evident that labor functioned not only as an economic mechanism but also as a central method through which order and discipline were maintained within the camp environment. And as this develops, the concept of organized movement becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners assigned to work details followed carefully regulated schedules that directed them from barracks to labor sites, and back again according to repeated daily patterns, and this structured movement reinforced the broader systems of visibility and control established throughout the camp. And as one reflects on these routines, it becomes clear that the repetition of labor assignments created a continuous rhythm within Buchenwald, where mornings, work periods, and evening returns unfolded, according to predictable sequences that shaped how prisoners experienced time and space, and this rhythm contributed to the sense of continuity defining camp life, where individual days became connected through repeated cycles of activity and supervision, and as this develops further, the variety of labor performed within and around the camp becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners were assigned to construction work, maintenance duties, workshops, storage operations, transportation tasks, and industrial support connected to the expanding needs of the camp system, and these assignments linked the prisoner population directly to the physical and operational growth of Buchenwald itself. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the environment of labor was characterized by constant movement and organized activity, where marching groups, repetitive mechanical sounds, construction noise, and the visible presence of work details created an atmosphere in which labor remained continuously visible throughout the camp, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that work had become inseparable from the structure of daily existence. And as this develops, the relationship between labor and hierarchy becomes increasingly important, where certain work assignments carried different levels of visibility, supervision, and physical demand, creating distinctions within the broader system of labor organization, and these distinctions influenced patterns of interaction and awareness among prisoners as they adapted to the structured environment surrounding them. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that forced labor contributed directly to the expansion and permanence of Buchenwald, where roads, buildings, storage facilities, and infrastructure continued to develop through the organized efforts of prisoners working under administrative control, and this process transformed the camp from a newly established site into a large and increasingly complex institution connected to broader systems of administration and industry. And as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners learned to navigate the expectations and rhythms associated with labor assignments, using observation and familiarity with routine to move through the structured environment more effectively. And this adaptation was shaped by repetition, where the consistent nature of daily schedules created patterns that gradually became understood through experience. And as we consider the perspective of those living within this labor system over extended periods, it becomes clear that work assignments shaped not only physical activity but also perception of the camp itself, where movement through labor sites and organized routines provided continuous exposure to the structures, hierarchies, and expansion of Buchenwald, and this exposure reinforced awareness of the camp as an environment constantly operating and developing through systems of organized labor. And as this develops, the relationship between labor, routine, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the operational structure of the camp, and thus the forced labor system at Buchenwald can be understood as one of the defining foundations of camp life, shaping the environment, the daily rhythms of existence, and the collective experience of those imprisoned within its expanding structure. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Workshops, Industry, and the Expansion of Controlled Labor. As one considers the continued development of forced labor within Buchenwald, the emergence of workshops and industrial activity becomes increasingly significant, and it becomes evident that the camp evolved beyond a confined administrative environment into a structured center of organized labor connected to wider economic and industrial systems, and as this develops, the relationship between industry and camp expansion becomes central, where the growth of workshops, storage facilities, and production areas transform sections of Buchenwald into spaces defined not only by confinement but by continuous organized activity, and this transformation shaped both the physical environment and the daily routines of prisoners assigned to labor within these areas. And as one reflects on the development of workshops inside the camp, it becomes clear that these spaces were designed according to the same principles of order and efficiency visible throughout Buchenwald, where buildings were arranged to support supervision, movement, and production in carefully regulated patterns, and this organization reinforced the broader atmosphere of structure and control defining the camp environment. And as this develops further, the nature of workshop labor becomes increasingly important, where prisoners were assigned to tasks connected to repair work, manufacturing, storage management, transportation of materials, and industrial support, creating a system in which labor extended far beyond construction and maintenance alone, and these activities connected Buchenwald to larger administrative and wartime economic networks operating across Germany, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that industrial activity altered the atmosphere of the camp itself, where mechanical sounds, movement of equipment, repetitive labor processes, and organized transportation of materials created an environment marked by constant operational activity, and this atmosphere reinforced the understanding that Buchenwald functioned not simply as a place of detention but as an institution integrated into broader systems of labor and production, and as this develops, the relationship between labor and time becomes increasingly apparent, where workshop schedules structured daily existence through repeated cycles of movement, assigned tasks, and regulated transitions between work areas and barracks, and this daily rhythm in which industrial labor became central to the organization of life within the camp. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the expansion of workshops and industrial facilities contributed directly to the increasing scale and permanence of Buchenwald, where additional buildings, infrastructure, and administrative systems were required to support growing labor operations, and this expansion transformed the camp into a more complex institution connected to external economic demands as well as internal systems of control, and as this develops further, the role of supervision within industrial labor becomes increasingly significant, where guards, overseers, and prisoner functionaries maintained organization and discipline throughout workshop environments, ensuring that labor activities aligned with administrative expectations and production requirements, and this visible supervision reinforced the broader structure of authority governing camp life. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to industrial labor routines, it becomes clear that familiarity with workshop environments, schedules, and expectations gradually shaped awareness of how the camp operated beyond the barracks and assembly grounds, and this awareness emerged through repeated exposure to organized systems of production and movement, and as this develops, the connection between labor, industry, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the operation and expansion of Buchenwald. And thus, the growth of workshops and industrial activity can be understood as a major stage in the camp's transformation into a structured labor institution deeply connected to systems of organized production and administrative control. As industrial activity continued to expand within and around Buchenwald, its influence extended beyond the physical environment and into the broader structure of daily life, shaping routines, social organization, and collective awareness among prisoners, and it becomes evident that the integration of workshops and production systems into the camp altered the rhythms of existence. By introducing increasingly specialized forms of labor connected to larger administrative and economic objectives, and as this develops, the concept of organized production becomes increasingly central, where labor within workshops followed carefully structured processes, designed around efficiency, supervision, and repetition, and these processes reinforced the broader operational principles already shaping the camp environment, and as one reflects on the atmosphere of workshop spaces, it becomes clear that they differed in important ways from open labor sites such as construction areas or roads, where enclosed buildings, mechanical activity, and concentrated production created environments defined by continuous repetitive motion and regulated organization, and this atmosphere shaped how prisoners experienced both labor and space within the camp system, and as this develops further, the relationship between industry and hierarchy becomes increasingly apparent, where different forms of labor carried varying levels of supervision, technical requirement, and administrative importance, creating distinctions within the broader structure of camp labor assignments, and these distinctions influenced movement, schedules, and patterns of interaction throughout Buchenwald. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that industrial environments introduced new layers of sound and rhythm into camp life, where machinery, tools, organized work processes, and coordinated transportation of materials produced a constant operational atmosphere that extended beyond individual workshops and into the broader perception of the camp as a functioning labor institution, and this atmosphere reinforced awareness that Buchenwald operated continuously through systems of production and organization, and as this develops, the relationship between industrial labor and routine becomes increasingly significant, where daily schedules were structured around the demands of production as much as administrative order, creating repeated cycles in which prisoners moved according to fixed timetables between barracks, workshops, storage areas, and assembly grounds, and this repetition contributed to the continuity defining daily existence, where individual experience became deeply tied to the rhythms of organized labor, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the expansion of industrial activity further connected Buchenwald to wider wartime systems operating beyond the camp itself, where labor performed within workshops supported external economic and military structures, and this connection reinforced the camp's role within a much larger network of organized administration and production, and as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners assigned to industrial labor gradually learned the routines, expectations, and physical organization of workshop environments through observation and repetition, and this familiarity shaped awareness of both the camp's internal systems and its broader operational purpose, and as we consider the perspective of those living within this expanding industrial structure, it becomes clear that labor assignments influenced not only physical activity but also understanding of the camp's scale and permanence, where the continuous growth of workshops and production areas signaled that Buchenwald was becoming increasingly integrated into larger systems extending far beyond the hill above Weimar, and this awareness contributed to the perception of the camp as a complex institution defined by organized labor and administrative control, and as this develops, the relationship between industry, routine, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the structured operation of Buchenwald, and thus the growth of workshops and industrial labor can be understood as one of the defining developments in the camp's evolution, shaping its physical expansion, operational identity, and the daily experience of those forced to live and work within its increasingly organized environment. Chapter 3, Segment 3. Labor Columns, Movement, and the Daily March of the Camp. As one considers the full integration of forced labor into the structure of Buchenwald, the organization of labor columns and the repeated movement of prisoners across the camp environment emerge as defining aspects of daily life, and it becomes evident that movement itself became highly regulated within the camp system, where groups of prisoners were organized into structured formations and directed according to fixed schedules connecting barracks, assembly grounds, workshops, construction areas, and external labor sites, and as this develops, the concept of collective movement becomes central, where individual activity was absorbed into coordinated group patterns designed for visibility, supervision, and administrative efficiency, and these patterns shaped how prisoners experienced both space and time within the camp, and as one reflects on the beginning of the workday, it becomes clear that the formation of labor columns represented an important continuation of the routines established during roll calls and assemblies, where prisoners gathered in organized groups before moving through the camp or beyond its immediate boundaries under supervision, and this transition from assembly into movement reinforced the atmosphere of structure and discipline defining Buchenwald, and as this develops further, the physical arrangement of labor columns becomes increasingly significant, where rows of prisoners moved together according to regulated formations, creating visible lines of coordinated activity that extended across roads, open grounds, and pathways through the camp environment, and this visual organization reflected the broader administrative emphasis on order and observation, ensuring that movement remained predictable and controlled. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the movement of labor columns created a distinct rhythm within daily camp life, where synchronized footsteps, repeated commands, opening gates, and the steady motion of groups contributed to an atmosphere of continuous operational activity, and this rhythm reinforced awareness that Buchenwald functioned through systems of organized labor extending into every part of the environment. And as this develops, the relationship between movement and geography becomes increasingly apparent, where labor assignments connected prisoners to different sections of the camp and surrounding region, shaping awareness of physical space through repeated travel between locations, and this repeated movement created familiarity with roads, work sites, fences, and administrative boundaries, reinforcing the structured geography of the camp itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that labor columns served not only practical purposes but symbolic ones as well, where the visible organization of movement demonstrated the administrative control governing daily life, transforming roads and open spaces into extensions of the camp system of discipline and supervision, and as this develops further, the concept of repetition becomes increasingly central, where the same movements occurred day after day, according to predictable schedules, creating patterns that shaped how prisoners experienced the daily life became structured through recurring cycles of assembly, marching, labor, and return, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to these routines, it becomes clear that awareness of movement schedules and labor routes became essential for navigating the environment, where familiarity with paths, timing, and expectations allowed individuals to orient themselves within the broader system, and this adaptation developed gradually through repeated exposure to organized movement and observation of routine, and as this develops, the connection between labor, movement, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each reinforced the others in maintaining the operation of Buchenwald, and thus the organization of labor columns and regulated movement can be understood as central mechanisms through which the camp structured daily existence, controlled physical space, and reinforced the atmosphere of order and supervision defining life within Buchenwald. As the daily movement of labor columns became more deeply embedded within the operation of Buchenwald, its influence extended beyond physical transportation and into the broader patterns of awareness, collective experience, and perception shaping camp life, and it becomes evident that the repeated organization of movement created a rhythm that connected different sections of the camp into a single coordinated system where roads, gates, work areas, and assembly grounds function together according to structured schedules regulating the flow of prisoners throughout the day, and as this develops, the concept of spatial routine becomes increasingly significant, where repeated travel along the same routes transformed movement itself into a familiar pattern, creating an environment in which geography and routine became closely interconnected. And as one reflects on this process, it becomes clear that labor columns shaped how prisoners perceived the physical scale of the camp and its surrounding labor network, where repeated exposure to roads, fences, industrial sites, forests, and construction areas gradually formed a mental map of the environment, and this awareness emerged not through formal explanation but through continuous participation in organized movement, and as this develops further, the relationship between labor movement and visibility becomes increasingly apparent, where the open arrangement of roads and pathways allowed guards and overseers to maintain observation over large groups, reinforcing the principles of surveillance and control shaping the broader camp system, and this visibility ensured that movement itself remained part of the structure of discipline, transforming the act of walking from one location to another into a regulated administrative process. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the daily march of labor columns contributed significantly to the atmosphere of Buchenwald, where repeated footsteps, shifting weather conditions, sounds of gates and commands, and the visual repetition of moving formations created a continuous operational rhythm extending across the camp environment, and this rhythm reinforced awareness that daily life was organized through uninterrupted systems of labor and movement, and as this develops, the role of external labor sites becomes increasingly significant, where some work details moved beyond the immediate camp grounds into surrounding areas connected to construction, industrial production, or infrastructure projects, and these movements extended the operational reach of Buchenwald while simultaneously reinforcing the isolation of prisoners through tightly controlled travel and supervision. And as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the organization of labor columns linked the internal routines of the camp to larger systems operating outside its fences, connecting Buchenwald to broader economic and administrative structures through daily patterns of organized labor movement, and this connection reinforced the camp's function as part of a wider network rather than an isolated institution. And as this develops, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners learned to interpret the rhythms and expectations associated with movement routines, using observation of schedules, routes, and labor assignments to navigate daily existence more effectively. and this adaptation was shaped by repetition, where the continuous return of the same patterns created familiarity within the otherwise restrictive environment, and as we consider the perspective of individuals living within this system over extended periods, it becomes clear that movement itself became one of the defining experiences of camp life, where daily marches connected routine, labor, geography, and authority into a single operational structure governing existence within Buchenwald, and this structure shaped not only physical activity but also awareness of time, space, and collective organization within the camp, and as this develops, the relationship between movement, discipline, and continuity becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the structured operation of Buchenwald, and thus the daily movement of labor columns can be understood as a central feature of camp life, shaping the physical rhythms, operational systems, and collective experience of those imprisoned within the organized environment of Buchenwald. Chapter 4, Segment 1. Fear, Observation, and the Atmosphere of Control. As one considers the deeper structure of life within Buchenwald beyond labor, routine, and administration, the atmosphere of fear emerges as one of the most defining elements shaping daily existence, and it becomes evident that fear within the camp was not always expressed through constant visible action but often through awareness itself, where the continuous presence of observation, discipline, and uncertainty created an environment in which prisoners understood that every movement unfolded within a system of control extending into all aspects of life, and as this develops, the relationship between fear and structure becomes increasingly clear, where the organization of the camp was designed not only for practical administration but also to reinforce authority through visibility and repetition, creating conditions in which the environment itself communicated power and supervision, and as one reflects on the physical layout of Buchenwald, it becomes clear that fences, guard towers, open assembly grounds, and straight internal roads all contributed to an atmosphere where observation remained constant, and this visibility shaped awareness by ensuring that prisoners moved through spaces where their actions could be monitored at nearly every moment, and as this develops further, the role of routine becomes increasingly significant, where repeated roll calls, inspections, organized movement, and regulated schedules reinforced the understanding that daily life unfolded according to systems controlled entirely by external authority, and this repetition created a continuous psychological framework in which uncertainty and discipline existed together, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of fear was reinforced through sound and silence alike, where shouted commands, whistles, footsteps, opening gates, and periods of tense quietness combined to create an environment defined by constant awareness. And this atmosphere shaped how prisoners interpreted both the visible and invisible aspects of camp life, reinforcing the sense that authority remained present even when direct supervision was not immediately visible, and as this develops, the relationship between observation and behavior becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners adapted their actions according to the expectations of the environment, learning through repetition and experience how movement, speech, posture, and timing were all influenced by the systems of discipline surrounding them, and this adaptation reflected the broader integration of fear into routine itself, where awareness of observation shaped daily existence continuously rather than only during moments of direct confrontation, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of Buchenwald depended heavily upon predictability combined with uncertainty, where prisoners understood the structure of daily routines while remaining aware that authority could intervene at any moment within that structure, and this combination reinforced the camp's system of control by ensuring that fear remained woven into ordinary activities and repeated procedures. And as this develops further, the role of guard towers and visible surveillance becomes increasingly symbolic, where elevated positions overlooking roads, barracks, and assembly grounds reinforced the sense that observation extended across the entire environment, transforming physical space itself into part of the system of supervision. And as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to this atmosphere, it becomes clear that awareness of observation gradually shaped perception of the camp as a whole, where movement through roads, entry into buildings, participation in roll calls, and even periods within the barracks occurred within a framework defined by constant visibility and regulation, and this awareness contributed to the collective understanding of Buchenwald as an environment built upon organized authority and controlled existence. And as this develops, the connection between fear, routine, and environment becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the atmosphere of the camp, and thus the system of observation and fear at Buchenwald can be understood as a central mechanism through which control extended beyond physical confinement into the daily awareness and perception of those imprisoned within its structure. As the atmosphere of fear and observation became more deeply embedded within daily life at Buchenwald, its influence extended beyond visible systems of surveillance and into the broader patterns of interaction, adaptation, and collective awareness shaping the camp environment. And it becomes evident that fear functioned not only through direct enforcement but through the constant understanding that authority remained present throughout every aspect of existence. And as this develops, the concept of internalized discipline becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners gradually adjusted their behavior according to the expectations and structures surrounding them, aligning movement, timing, and routine with the systems of control operating across the camp, and this adjustment reflected the broader integration of observation into daily life itself. And as one reflects on the organization of space within Buchenwald, it becomes clear that the design of the camp reinforced this atmosphere continuously, where open grounds, visible pathways, controlled entrances, and structured Baroque arrangements ensured that movement remained observable and predictable, and this predictability supported the administrative systems, maintaining order within the environment. And as this develops further, the relationship between collective awareness and fear becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners living within shared barracks and participating in repeated routines developed a common understanding of the atmosphere surrounding them, recognizing through observation how authority shaped behavior and movement throughout the camp, and this shared awareness contributed to the collective experience of Buchenwald as a place defined not only by physical confinement but by continuous psychological pressure created through visibility and uncertainty. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the sounds and rhythms of camp life reinforced this atmosphere constantly, where whistles signaling movement, footsteps across assembly grounds, repeated commands, opening gates, and sudden moments of silence all contributed to a sense of ongoing supervision and structured control. And this auditory environment shaped perception by making the presence of authority continuously recognizable even without direct interaction. And as this develops, the role of unpredictability within routine becomes increasingly significant, where the repetition of schedules and procedures created familiarity while the possibility of interruption or intervention preserved uncertainty. and this balance between order and unpredictability reinforced the atmosphere of fear by ensuring that prisoners remained continuously aware of the authority governing the environment, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that fear within Buchenwald was deeply connected to the camps. Systems of organization where architecture, routine, movement, and surveillance worked together to create an environment in which control extended into perception itself, and this integration shaped how prisoners understood both themselves and the space surrounding them, and as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where individuals learned to navigate the atmosphere of observation through careful attention to routine, timing, and visible expectations, using familiarity with the camp structure to reduce uncertainty where possible within the restrictive environment, and this adaptation emerged gradually through repetition and exposure to the systems of discipline surrounding daily life, and as we consider the perspective of those living within this atmosphere over extended periods, it becomes clear that awareness of surveillance and control became inseparable from ordinary existence itself, where even familiar routines remained connected to the larger structures of authority defining the camp, and this awareness reinforced the perception of Buchenwald as an institution built upon visibility, regulation, and organized fear, and as this develops, the relationship between observation, discipline, and collective experience becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the operational structure of the camp, and thus the atmosphere of fear and observation within Buchenwald can be understood as one of the defining foundations of camp life, shaping behavior, perception, and the collective experience of those forced to exist within its controlled environment. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Punishment, Discipline, and the Visible Presence of Authority. As one considers the atmosphere of control within Buchenwald, the systems of punishment and discipline emerge as central mechanisms through which authority maintained visibility and reinforced order throughout the camp, and it becomes evident that discipline was not limited to isolated moments of correction or enforcement, but functioned continuously through structures, routines, and repeated demonstrations of authority that shaped awareness across all aspects of daily life, and as this develops, the relationship between punishment and visibility becomes increasingly clear, where disciplinary actions often carried a public dimension intended not only to regulate individual behavior but also to reinforce collective awareness of the power governing the environment, and this visibility contributed significantly to the atmosphere of fear already embedded within the camp structure, and as one reflects on the organization of daily routines, it becomes clear that discipline was integrated directly into ordinary procedures such as roll calls, inspections, movement between work sites, and Baroque organization where expectations regarding posture, timing, and obedience were reinforced through constant supervision and repeated correction, and this integration ensured that discipline became inseparable from routine itself, shaping how prisoners navigated every stage of the day. And as this develops further, the physical spaces associated with punishment become increasingly significant, where assembly grounds, administrative buildings, and designated disciplinary areas functioned not only as practical locations within the camp but as visible symbols of authority and regulation, and these spaces reinforced the understanding that control extended throughout the environment rather than existing only within isolated moments of enforcement, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of discipline was reinforced through repeated sounds and visual patterns where commands, whistles, marching formations, inspections, and the sudden of authority, and this atmosphere shaped perception by ensuring that prisoners remained attentive to both visible supervision and the possibility of disciplinary intervention, and as this develops, the relationship between discipline and routine becomes increasingly interconnected, where repeated procedures created expectations regarding behavior while disciplinary systems reinforced those expectations through visible enforcement, and this combination allowed the camp to maintain order through both structure and fear, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that punishment within Buchenwald served not only practical, administrative purposes but symbolic ones as well, where visible disciplinary measures reinforced the hierarchy separating guards, administrators, prisoner functionaries, and the broader prisoner population, and this hierarchy shaped daily interactions by continuously emphasizing the unequal distribution of authority within the camp, and as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners learned to interpret the expectations surrounding discipline through observation and repetition, adjusting movement, speech, and behavior according to the visible structures of authority defining the environment, and this adaptation emerged gradually as familiarity with routines and disciplinary practices shaped awareness of how the camp operated, and as we consider the perspective of individuals living within this system over extended periods, it becomes clear that discipline influenced perception far beyond isolated moments of punishment, where the constant possibility of correction or intervention shaped the atmosphere of ordinary daily life itself, and this awareness contributed to the broader understanding of Buchenwald as an environment governed through organized systems of supervision, regulation, and visible authority, and as this develops, the connection between punishment, discipline, and fear becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational structure of the camp, and thus the systems of punishment and discipline within Buchenwald can be understood as central components of its atmosphere of control, shaping behavior, awareness, and collective experience through the continuous visible presence of authority. As the systems of punishment and discipline became more deeply embedded within the daily operation of Buchenwald, their influence extended beyond direct enforcement into the broader psychological and social environment shaping camp life, and it becomes evident that discipline functioned most effectively not only through individual acts of punishment but through the constant awareness that authority could intervene at any moment within the structured routines of the camp, and as this develops, the concept of anticipatory control becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners adjusted their behavior according to expectations formed through observation of routine, visible supervision, and repeated examples of enforcement, and this anticipation shaped movement and interaction throughout the environment, reinforcing the broader systems of order governing daily existence, and as one reflects on the role of visibility within disciplinary systems, it becomes clear that authority relied heavily upon observable structure, where guards, overseers, and prisoner functionaries occupied positions ensuring that supervision remained continuously present across roads, barracks, assembly grounds, and labor sites, and this visible presence transformed ordinary spaces into environments of regulation and observation, and as this develops further, the relationship between collective experience and discipline becomes increasingly apparent, where repeated exposure to routines of inspection, correction, and enforcement created a shared awareness among prisoners regarding the expectations governing camp life, and this collective awareness contributed to the atmosphere of caution and attentiveness defining interaction within Buchenwald, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that discipline shaped the auditory and visual rhythms of the camp itself, where shouted orders, synchronized movement, sudden silences, repeated inspections, and the interruption of routine all reinforced the understanding that authority remained active throughout daily life, and this sensory environment contributed to the perception of Buchenwald as a place where structure and discipline extended into every visible aspect of existence, and as this develops, the role of prisoner functionaries within disciplinary systems becomes increasingly significant, where certain prisoners assigned organizational responsibilities participated in maintaining order within barracks and labor groups, reinforcing the layered hierarchy operating inside the camp, and this hierarchy complicated social relationships by embedding systems of supervision within the prisoner population itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that punishment and discipline contributed not only to administrative efficiency but also to the broader psychological atmosphere of Buchenwald, where fear and routine became interconnected through repeated exposure to authority and correction, and this connection shaped how prisoners understood the boundaries and expectations of the environment surrounding them, and as this develops further, the concept of adaptation becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners learned to navigate the disciplinary structure through careful attention to timing, posture, movement, and routine, using familiarity with expectations to avoid disruption within the restrictive environment, and this adaptation reflected the gradual internalization of the camp systems of control, where awareness of authority became integrated into ordinary daily behavior, and as we consider the perspective of those living within this structure over long periods, it becomes clear that discipline influenced perception continuously, rather than occasionally, shaping how prisoners interpreted both routine activities and the atmosphere of the camp itself, and this influence reinforced the broader identity of Buchenwald as an institution built upon organized supervision and visible authority, and as this develops, the relationship between punishment, hierarchy, and collective awareness becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in maintaining the operational systems defining camp life, and thus the structures of punishment and discipline at Buchenwald can be understood as foundational mechanisms through which authority shaped not only behavior but also perception, adaptation, and the collective experience of those imprisoned within the camp's controlled environment. Chapter 4, Segment 3. Silence, Uncertainty, and the Psychological Weight of the Camp. As one considers the atmosphere of Buchenwald beyond its visible systems of labor, discipline, and routine, another dimension of camp life begins to emerge through the quieter and less immediately visible aspects of existence, and it becomes evident that silence and uncertainty played a significant role in shaping the psychological environment surrounding prisoners, where the absence of clear information, the unpredictability of future events, and the constant awareness of authority created a condition in which uncertainty itself became part of daily life, and as this develops, the relationship between silence and control becomes increasingly apparent, where information within the camp was limited, fragmented, and often shaped through observation, rather than explanation, forcing prisoners to interpret their surroundings through visible patterns, repeated routines, and indirect awareness of the systems operating around them, and this environment reinforced the sense that understanding the camp required constant attention to details rather than formal communication, and as one reflects on the structure of daily existence, it becomes clear that routine itself contributed to this atmosphere, where repeated schedules created predictability in movement and labor, while larger questions regarding future conditions, transfers, punishments, or administrative decisions remained uncertain, and this combination of repetition and unpredictability shaped awareness by ensuring that ordinary activities unfolded within a broader atmosphere of unresolved tension, and as this develops further, the physical environment of Buchenwald contributed strongly to the psychological weight of uncertainty, where fences, guard towers, fog-covered roads, crowded barracks, and distant sections of the camp visible but inaccessible reinforced the understanding that much of the environment remained beyond direct knowledge or control, and this partial visibility shaped perception by creating a sense that authority extended into spaces and decisions hidden from ordinary prisoners, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that silence itself carried significant meaning. Within the camp atmosphere, where moments without commands or movement often intensified awareness rather than reducing it, and the quietness of nighttime barracks, the stillness before morning assembly, or the silence following disciplinary events contributed to an environment in which uncertainty remained continuously present, and this silence contrasted sharply with the repetitive sounds of daily routine, creating alternating rhythms of activity and quiet tension throughout camp life, and as this develops, becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners relied heavily upon watching routines, movements of guards, changing schedules, and visible reactions within the camp in order to interpret conditions and anticipate possible developments, and this reliance on observation reinforced the atmosphere of constant attentiveness defining life within Buchenwald, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the psychological weight of the camp depended not only upon visible authority but upon the continual awareness that the environment operated according to systems often inaccessible to those living within it, and this awareness shaped behavior by encouraging caution, attentiveness, and adaptation within conditions where certainty remained limited, and as this develops further, the concept of collective uncertainty becomes increasingly apparent, where shared living conditions and repeated routines created common patterns of awareness among prisoners, linking individuals through the same atmosphere of limited information and continuous observation, and this collective experience reinforced the broader perception of Buchenwald as a place governed as much by uncertainty and psychological pressure as by physical confinement itself, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners adapting to this environment over extended periods, it becomes clear that silence and uncertainty gradually became integrated into ordinary existence, shaping how individuals interpreted routine, authority, and the camp environment itself, and thus the atmosphere of silence and uncertainty within Buchenwald can be understood as one of the defining psychological dimensions of camp life, influencing perception, awareness, and collective experience throughout daily existence. As the atmosphere of silence and uncertainty became more deeply embedded within the daily operation of Buchenwald, its influence extended beyond individual awareness and into the broader collective psychology shaping the camp environment, and it becomes evident that uncertainty functioned not as an occasional condition but as a constant background to existence, where prisoners moved through routines and labor assignments while remaining continuously aware that larger administrative decisions, disciplinary measures, and future developments remained outside their control or understanding, and as this develops, the concept of psychological adaptation becomes increasingly significant, where individuals gradually learn to navigate an environment defined by incomplete knowledge through observation, caution, and close attention to patterns of routine and authority, and this adaptation reflected the broader relationship between uncertainty and survival within the camp structure, and as one reflects on the daily rhythms of Buchenwald, it becomes clear that moments of transition often intensified this atmosphere, where changes in schedules, unexpected inspections, altered labor assignments, or visible movement among guards could create heightened awareness throughout the prisoner population, and this sensitivity to disruption reinforced the understanding that routine itself existed within a larger system capable of sudden intervention. And as this develops further, the role of collective observation becomes increasingly apparent, where prisoners interpreted the environment not only through personal experience but through shared attention to behavior, movement, and visible changes within the camp, and this collective awareness created informal systems of interpretation shaped through silence, observation, and repeated exposure to the atmosphere surrounding them. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that quietness within the camp often carried emotional and psychological weight equal to visible activity, where nighttime stillness inside crowded barracks, distant sounds echoing across open grounds, footsteps outside during periods of darkness, or pauses within routine all contributed to an environment in which silence itself reinforced attentiveness and uncertainty. And this sensory atmosphere shaped perception by ensuring that prisoners remained continuously aware of the surrounding systems of authority even during moments without direct interaction. And as this develops, the relationship between environment and psychology becomes increasingly interconnected, where the physical structure of the camp supported the atmosphere of uncertainty. Through restricted visibility, inaccessible administrative areas, guarded boundaries, and controlled movement between spaces, reinforcing the sense that much of camp life remained governed by systems beyond direct understanding, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the psychological weight of Buchenwald depended heavily upon this combination of visible structure and hidden authority, where prisoners experienced daily routines within an environment constantly reminding them of the limits of their knowledge and control, and this combination strengthened the broader systems of discipline and fear shaping the camp. And as this develops further, the concept of continuity becomes increasingly significant, where uncertainty itself became normalized through repetition, gradually integrating into ordinary perception and shaping how prisoners interpreted both routine and change within the environment. And this normalization reflected the broader adaptation of individuals living under continuous systems of surveillance and administrative control. And as we consider the perspective of those imprisoned within this atmosphere over long periods, it becomes clear that silence and uncertainty influenced not only emotional experience but also patterns of movement, interaction, and awareness throughout daily life, contributing to the broader identity of Buchenwald as an institution defined as much by psychological pressure as by physical confinement and labor. And as this develops, the relationship between uncertainty, observation, and collective experience becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in shaping the atmosphere of the camp. And thus, the silence and psychological uncertainty surrounding life within Buchenwald can be understood as central aspects of its operational structure, shaping perception, adaptation, and the collective experience of those forced to exist within its controlled and continuously observed environment. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The expansion of the camp network and the reach of Buchenwald. As one considers the later development of Buchenwald beyond its original construction on the Ettersberg hill, the expansion of the camp network emerges as one of the most significant transformations shaping its role within the broader concentration camp system, and it becomes evident that Buchenwald gradually evolved from a single confined institution into the administrative center of a much larger network connected through labor, transportation, and industrial organization, and as this develops, the relationship between expansion and control becomes increasingly clear, where the growth of satellite camps, external labor detachments, and industrial work sites extended the operational reach of Buchenwald far beyond the visible boundaries of the main camp itself, creating a system in which movement, labor, and administration were linked across multiple locations, and as one reflects on the reasons behind this expansion, it becomes clear that the increasing demand for labor during the war years played a major role, where industries, construction projects, transportation systems, and military production required large organized labor forces, and the camp administration responded by establishing additional sites connected directly to Buchenwald's central structure, and as this develops further, the concept of decentralization becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners assigned to external labor detachments were transported to factories, quarries, workshops, and construction zones located away from the main camp, yet remained administratively tied to Buchenwald through records, schedules, supervision, and organizational control, and this structure transformed the camp from a single environment into a networked system extending across different regions and industrial operations, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of expansion altered the rhythms of daily life within the main camp itself, where transportation activity, movement of labor groups, arrival of new prisoners, and administrative coordination created an environment marked by increasing operational complexity, and this atmosphere reinforced awareness that Buchenwald was no longer functioning only as an isolated hilltop camp, but as the center of a broader labor network integrated into larger wartime systems, and as this develops, the relationship between geography and administration becomes increasingly apparent, where roads, rail connections, industrial zones, and surrounding regions became linked through organized transportation and labor assignments, shaping how prisoners experienced movement and confinement within a constantly expanding structure, and this geographical expansion reinforced the operational identity of Buchenwald as part of a much wider institutional system, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the growth of satellite camps and external labor detachments altered the perception of scale within the camp environment, where the increasing movement of prisoners between locations signaled that the systems of organization and authority defining Buchenwald extended far beyond the fences visible from the main camp grounds, and this awareness shaped collective understanding of the institution itself, and as this develops further, the role of administration becomes increasingly central, where records, classifications, transportation schedules, and labor coordination systems were required to manage the expanding network connected to Buchenwald, and this administrative growth reinforced the broader emphasis on organization and documentation defining the camp system from its earliest years, and as we consider the perspective of prisoners living through this period of expansion, it becomes clear that awareness of transfers, labor detachments, and external camps gradually became integrated into ordinary camp life, influencing perception of movement, uncertainty, and the larger operational structure surrounding them, and this awareness emerged through observation of changing routines and increasing administrative complexity within the environment, and as this develops, the connection between expansion, labor, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supported the others in transforming Buchenwald into a major center within the concentration camp network, and thus the expansion of the camp system can be understood as a defining stage in the evolution of Buchenwald, shaping its operational reach, administrative structure, and the collective experience of those imprisoned within its growing sphere of control. As the network connected to Buchenwald continued to expand during the war years, its influence extended beyond physical geography and into the broader organization of camp life, shaping routines, perceptions, and the collective understanding of the institution itself, and it becomes evident that the growth of satellite camps and external labor detachments transformed Buchenwald into an increasingly complex administrative center where coordination, transportation, and labor management became central to daily operations, and as this develops, the concept of interconnected systems becomes increasingly significant, where the main camp functioned not only as a site of confinement but also as a hub linking multiple labor sites, industrial facilities, and subsidiary camps through organized schedules and administrative oversight, and this interconnected structure reinforced the broader role of Buchenwald within wartime labor systems, and as one reflects on the movement between camps and labor detachments, it becomes clear that transportation itself became an important part of the operational rhythm surrounding Buchenwald, where groups of prisoners were regularly transferred according to labor demands, creating continuous patterns of departure, arrival, and redistribution across the expanding network, and this movement contributed to an atmosphere of instability and uncertainty within the prisoner population, where the possibility of reassignment or transfer remained constantly present, and as this develops further, the relationship between industrial production and camp expansion becomes increasingly apparent, where factories, construction projects, and military industries relied heavily upon organized labor supplied through the camp network, and this dependence reinforced the administrative importance of maintaining detailed records, schedules, and systems of supervision across multiple locations. And as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of the main camp changed as expansion continued, where increased transportation activity, administrative coordination, movement of materials, and visible growth in organizational complexity created an environment marked by continuous operational activity extending beyond the immediate routines of labor and roll calls, and this atmosphere reinforced awareness that Buchenwald had become part of a much larger structure connected through labor and administration to external systems, operating across Germany and occupied territories, and as this develops, the relationship between visibility and distance becomes increasingly significant, where many prisoners remained physically confined within one section of the system while simultaneously aware that the broader network extended into numerous unseen locations, and this partial awareness shaped perception by creating a sense of vastness surrounding the camp structure itself, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the expansion of the Buchenwald network reinforced the administrative principles already defining the camp, where classification, documentation, supervision, and organized movement remained central even as the scale of operations increased dramatically, and this continuity demonstrated how the systems first established within the main camp adapted to support increasingly large and dispersed labor operations, and as this develops further, the concept of collective awareness becomes increasingly nuanced, where prisoners interpreted the growing complexity of the camp system through observation of transfers, changing labor assignments, new arrivals, and expanding routines, gradually forming an understanding that Buchenwald functioned within a larger interconnected structure extending far beyond the visible boundaries of the hilltop camp, and this awareness contributed to the perception of the camp as an institution constantly growing in scale and operational reach, and as we consider the perspective of those living within this expanding network over time, it becomes clear that movement, uncertainty, and administrative complexity became defining features of the broader Buchenwald system, shaping how prisoners understood both their immediate environment and the larger structures surrounding it, and as this develops, the relationship between expansion, transportation, and authority becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element reinforced the others in maintaining the operational systems of the camp network, and thus the expansion of Buchenwald into a wider system of satellite camps and labor detachments can be understood as one of the defining developments in its history, shaping its administrative identity, operational structure, and the collective experience of those imprisoned within its growing network of control. Chapter 5, Segment 2. The Final Years of the Camp and the Collapse of the System. As one considers the later years of Buchenwald during the final phase of the war, the atmosphere of the camp began to change under the pressure of expanding conflict, growing instability, and the gradual weakening of the larger system supporting its operation, and it becomes evident that, while the routines of labor, discipline, and administration continued to function, the broader conditions surrounding the camp were shifting in ways that increasingly affected daily life within its boundaries, and as this develops, the relationship between continuity and collapse becomes increasingly apparent, where the camp attempted to maintain the appearance of order through repeated routines and administrative procedures, even as transportation networks, supply systems, and wartime conditions around it became more unstable, and this tension shaped the atmosphere of the final years, creating an environment where familiar structures remained visible while uncertainty surrounding the future grew steadily stronger, and as one reflects on the expanding pressure placed upon the camp system during this period, it becomes clear that increasing numbers of prisoners arrived from evacuated camps and labor sites elsewhere, contributing to overcrowding and altering the rhythms of daily existence within Buchenwald, and these arrivals reflected the broader movement occurring across the concentration camp network as front lines shifted and authorities attempted to reorganize labor and confinement systems under worsening wartime conditions, and as this develops further, the concept of overcrowding becomes increasingly significant, where barracks designed for already limited living conditions became more densely occupied, intensifying the atmosphere of collective strain shaping camp life, and this change influenced movement, routine, and awareness within the camp where the visible, affecting its operation directly, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the atmosphere of the camp grew increasingly tense and unsettled, where constant movement of prisoners, frequent administrative activity, transportation operations, and the visible strain upon infrastructure contributed to an environment marked by uncertainty and exhaustion, and this atmosphere contrasted with the more rigid stability characterizing earlier phases of camp life, reinforcing awareness that the broader wartime situation was altering the operational structure of Buchenwald itself, and as this develops, the relationship between routine and instability becomes increasingly interconnected, where roll calls, labor assignments, and systems of supervision continued according to familiar patterns while shortages, transfers, and overcrowding disrupted the consistency that had previously defined camp existence, and this contradiction shaped perception by creating an environment in which order and deterioration existed simultaneously, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that The final years of Buchenwald revealed the dependence of the camp system upon the larger wartime structures supporting it, where transportation, industrial coordination, administrative communication, and supply systems all became increasingly difficult to maintain under the pressure of military collapse, and this weakening gradually affected the atmosphere and operation of the camp. And as this develops further, the role of uncertainty becomes increasingly central, where prisoners observe changes in routines, increased transfers, and growing tension among authorities without fully understanding how events beyond the camp would shape their future. And this uncertainty reinforced the psychological atmosphere already present within Buchenwald, while intensifying awareness of instability surrounding the environment. And as we consider the perspective of those imprisoned during this period, it becomes clear that the final years of the camp were experienced through a combination of familiar routine and visible disruption, where daily life continued within structures increasingly strained by the collapse unfolding around them, and this experience shaped collective understanding of Buchenwald as an institution attempting to preserve order within a rapidly changing wartime reality. And as this develops, the connection between collapse, routine, and perception becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element influenced the others in shaping the atmosphere of the camp's final phase, and thus the later years of Buchenwald can be understood as a period in which the established systems of control and organization persisted even as the broader structures supporting them moved steadily toward collapse. As the final phase of the war continued to unfold around Buchenwald, the weakening of the larger concentration camp system became increasingly visible within the daily operation of the camp itself, and it becomes evident that the structures of administration, labor, and discipline which had defined Buchenwald for years were now functioning within conditions of growing instability, where transportation disruptions, overcrowding, and uncertainty surrounding military developments affected both the atmosphere and routines of daily life. And as this develops, the concept of systemic strain becomes increasingly significant, where the camp administration attempted to maintain control through familiar procedures even as the broader organizational systems supporting those procedures became more difficult to sustain, and this strain shaped the experience of prisoners by altering the predictability that had once defined camp existence. And as one reflects on the increasing movement of prisoners during this period, it becomes clear that transfers from other camps and labor sites intensified the sense of instability within Buchenwald, where newly arrived groups brought visible evidence of the changing wartime situation, while overcrowding placed additional pressure upon barracks, labor assignments, and camp infrastructure, and this constant movement reinforced awareness that the concentration camp network itself was undergoing major disruption. And as this develops further, the relationship between administration and uncertainty becomes increasingly apparent, where officials continued to organize roll calls, labor schedules, transportation operations, and disciplinary systems while simultaneously responding to conditions that were becoming less predictable and more difficult to manage. And this contradiction created an atmosphere in which authority remained visible yet increasingly strained, and as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the camp environment reflected these changes through heightened movement, repeated transportation activity, visible exhaustion within routines, and a growing atmosphere of tension surrounding administrative operations. And this sensory environment reinforced the understanding that Buchenwald was no longer functioning within the stable structures that had shaped its earlier years. And as this develops, the role of information and rumor becomes increasingly significant, where prisoners interpreted changing conditions through observation of movements, visible changes in authority behavior, and fragments of knowledge regarding military developments. Beyond the camp, and this atmosphere of partial awareness intensified the uncertainty already embedded within daily life, shaping collective perception of the final phase of the camp's operation, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that the collapse of the larger wartime system gradually exposed the dependence of Buchenwald upon external structures of transportation, communication, industrial production, and military authority, where the weakening of these systems directly affected the camp's ability to maintain its established routines and operational efficiency, and this exposure revealed how deeply connected the camp had always been to the broader political and military structures surrounding it, and as this develops further, the concept of continuity within collapse becomes increasingly important, where ordinary routines such as labor assignments, assemblies, and inspections continued even as the larger environment became increasingly unstable, creating a strange coexistence of repetition and breakdown within daily camp life, and this coexistence shaped how prisoners experienced time. During the final months of Buchenwald's operation, where familiar structures persisted inside a rapidly changing external reality, and as we consider the perspective of those imprisoned during this period, it becomes clear that awareness of collapse developed gradually through observation, rather than direct explanation, where changes in movement, atmosphere, and routine revealed that the systems governing the camp were weakening even as they continued to function, and this awareness contributed to a broader understanding that the environment surrounding Buchenwald was entering its final stage, and as this develops, the relationship between instability, authority, and perception becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element shaped the others in defining the final operational atmosphere of the camp, and thus the last years of Buchenwald can be understood as a period in which the established systems of discipline and organization continued to operate within conditions of growing collapse, shaping the final experience of those imprisoned within its increasingly strained environment. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Memory, Liberation, and the Lasting Meaning of Buchenwald. As one considers the final stage in the history of Buchenwald, the transition from the camp's operation into memory and historical reflection emerges as a defining moment in understanding its lasting significance, and it becomes evident that the end of the camp did not erase the structures, routines, and atmosphere that had shaped life within it for years, but instead transformed Buchenwald into a place remembered through physical remains, personal testimony, historical documentation, and collective awareness, and as this develops, the relationship between liberation and memory becomes increasingly clear, where the collapse of the camp system marked not only the end of organized confinement within Buchenwald but also the beginning of a long process through which the meaning of the camp would be interpreted, studied, and preserved, and this process shaped how future generations understood both the environment itself and the broader systems that created it, and as one reflects on the final days surrounding the liberation of the camp, it becomes clear that the atmosphere of uncertainty and collapse defining the last phase of Buchenwald gradually gave way to a different form of awareness, where prisoners and observers alike confronted the physical reality of an institution that had operated for years through systems of labor, discipline, observation, and organized control, and this confrontation transformed the camp from an active environment into a historical site carrying visible traces of its past operation, and as this develops further, the physical structure of Buchenwald becomes increasingly significant within memory itself, where fences, guard towers, barracks foundations, roads, assembly grounds, and surrounding forests remained as material reminders of the environment shaping daily existence within the camp, and these spaces continued to communicate aspects of the camp structure long after routine and administration had ceased to function. And, as we consider the sensory aspects of this stage, it becomes evident that the silence following liberation altered perception of the camp dramatically, where spaces once defined by movement, commands, labor columns, and constant supervision became quiet, transforming familiar structures into still environments carrying the weight of memory and reflection, and this silence contributed to the understanding of Buchenwald not only as a historical institution but as a place where absence itself carried meaning, and as this develops, the role of testimony becomes increasingly central, where survivors, witnesses, and historical investigators sought to describe the routines, systems, and atmosphere shaping life within the camp, and these accounts became essential for preserving understanding of how Buchenwald operated beyond its physical remains. Alone, connecting memory to lived experience through observation and reflection, and as one reflects on the broader implications, it becomes evident that memory of Buchenwald extends beyond the camp itself into larger questions regarding authority, organization, human behavior, and the consequences of systems built upon exclusion and control, and this broader significance shapes why the history of the camp continues to be studied and remembered decades after its liberation, and as this develops further, the concept of historical responsibility becomes increasingly apparent, where preserving the memory of Buchenwald involves more than documenting dates or structures, requiring continued attention to the atmosphere, routines, and systems that shaped daily existence within the camp, and this responsibility reflects the understanding that historical memory depends upon careful observation and interpretation rather than simplification, and as we consider the perspective of those reflecting upon Buchenwald in later years, it becomes clear that the camp exists today not only as a physical site but as a symbol of how organized systems of authority and fear can transform ordinary environments into institutions of confinement and control, and this symbolic meaning continues to shape historical reflection and collective awareness surrounding the camp, and as this develops, the connection between memory, environment, and understanding becomes increasingly interconnected, where physical remains, historical records, and personal accounts together preserve the complex reality of Buchenwald's operation, and thus the liberation and remembrance of Buchenwald can be understood as the beginning of an ongoing process through which the camp's history continues to inform reflection upon authority, human systems, and the enduring importance of historical memory. As the years following the liberation of Buchenwald continued to pass, the camp increasingly became a place defined not by active operation but by remembrance, interpretation, and the continuing effort to understand the systems that once shaped life within its boundaries, and it becomes evident that memory itself developed in layers, where physical remains, survivor testimony, historical research, photographs, official documents, and preserved landscapes combined to create an evolving understanding of what Buchenwald represented within the broader history of the 20th century, and as this develops, the concept of preservation becomes increasingly significant, where sections of the camp, including roads, foundations, fences, and memorial areas, were maintained so that future generations could observe the physical structure of the environment and reflect upon how organization, routine, and authority operated within it, and this preservation transformed the camp into a historical site where silence and Stillness replaced the constant movement that once defined daily life, and as one reflects on the experience of visiting Buchenwald after the war, it becomes clear that the environment itself continues to communicate aspects of its history, where the open grounds, remaining towers, forested surroundings, and visible traces of barracks create an atmosphere shaped by absence as much as by physical structure, and this atmosphere encourages reflection upon the relationship between ordinary landscapes and extraordinary systems of control, and as this develops further, the role of education becomes increasingly important, where museums, archives, memorial programs, and historical studies seek to preserve not only factual information but also understanding of the atmosphere and structures defining camp life, and these efforts emphasize careful historical responsibility, ensuring that the history of Buchenwald is remembered through observation, documentation, and contextual understanding rather than distortion or simplification. And as we consider the sensory aspects of memory, it becomes evident that modern silence at the site stands in sharp contrast to the sounds once associated with the camp, where marching labor, columns, whistles, commands, machinery, and repeated routines have disappeared, leaving behind an environment where quiet reflection replaces operational activity, and this contrast shapes how transformation into a place of remembrance, and as this develops, the broader historical significance of Buchenwald becomes increasingly apparent, where the camp serves not only as a record of confinement and forced labor but also as an example of how administrative systems, routine organization, industrial coordination, and visible authority can combine to create environments built upon exclusion and control, and this significance extends beyond the specific history of the camp into larger reflections upon institutions, political systems, and collective responsibility, and as one reflects on the importance of continuing to study and remember Buchenwald, it becomes evident that memory serves as a safeguard against forgetting the structures and conditions that allowed such institutions to operate, and this role of memory remains essential because the systems shaping Buchenwald were constructed gradually through organization, normalization, and administrative expansion rather than through sudden isolated actions alone, and as this develops further, the concept of reflection becomes increasingly central, where the preserved environment of Buchenwald invites consideration not only of historical events but of the ways routine, discipline, labor, and fear shaped ordinary daily existence within the camp, and this reflective understanding contributes to a deeper awareness of how human systems operate under conditions of concentrated authority and restricted freedom, and as we consider the perspective of those encountering the history of Buchenwald today, it becomes clear that the camp continues to hold meaning because its structures, records, and preserved spaces reveal how ordinary routines and organized systems can be transformed into instruments of confinement and control when detached from moral responsibility and human dignity, and this understanding shapes the lasting legacy of Buchenwald within historical memory, and as this develops, the relationship between remembrance, responsibility, and historical understanding becomes increasingly interconnected, where each element supports the continued effort to preserve and interpret the history of the camp with seriousness and care, and thus the memory of Buchenwald remains not only a record of the past but a continuing reminder of the importance of vigilance, historical awareness, and reflection in understanding the consequences of organized systems built upon fear, exclusion, and absolute control. Buchenwald stood on a quiet hill above Weimar, surrounded by forests, roads, and ordinary landscapes that still exist today. Yet within that environment an entire system was constructed, around routine, labor, observation, fear, and control. What made the camp significant was not only the physical structures that once stood there, but the organized systems that allowed daily life inside the camp to continue for years through discipline, administration, and silence. As we reflect on the history of Buchenwald, it becomes evident that understanding the camp requires more than remembering dates or events alone. It requires observing how ordinary structures, routines, and institutions can gradually become instruments of confinement when authority operates without accountability or human dignity. The preserved grounds, surviving records, and testimonies left behind continue to remind us how important historical awareness remains, especially as time passes and direct witnesses become fewer. The history of Buchenwald is difficult, but it remains essential to study carefully, responsibly, and with reflection, because memory itself plays a role in ensuring that these systems are neither ignored nor forgotten. If you value long-form historical documentaries told with calm narration, deep research, and historical responsibility, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps continue these detailed explorations into history, memory, and the environments that shaped the modern world. Thank you for watching.